All right, cool. Yeah, thank you for the intro, and I'm really excited to be here actually because I've been following Preeti, and she's been doing this type of work for a very long time, way before me even. So, pretty cool to be able to collaborate and be a part of this 1 hour session, and hopefully I can leave you with some knowledge that you didn't have before. And if we can accomplish that, then we've at least done something right. So. Yeah, my name is Nader, though. I've been in the Web3 space since about April. Before that, I was a software engineer and also a teacher and developer relations engineer and author, and did a bunch of stuff, but I was in the Web2 space, quote unquote, whatever that means to you, traditional web developer, mainly focused on cloud computing, front end and mobile development. So I did a lot of React, I did a lot of React Native, I did Angular before that, and jQuery, and just general front end CSS, HTML stuff before that. And what really drew me to Web3 was that I felt like I was getting a little bored with my traditional software development. And I felt like we were not really solving any problems that were that interesting to me at that point. We were kind of reinventing the wheel almost in a lot of the stuff we were doing at AWS. And I kind of saw Web3 as this new paradigm that I could build for, and it kind of is a nice accompaniment to the existing skill set that I have. So I feel like with this new skill set, yes, I can work in a blockchain company, and I can build out these financial applications on Web3, or all these other things I can do. But I still have all of those existing skills that I had. So I kind of just opening the door to more opportunities. And with the current market as we see it today, there's just so much competition for developers. Having this additional skill set will just not only allow you to build stuff on your own if you decide to open your own company or whatever, but obviously the job market will just be opened up for you a lot more. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, since everyone that's here, learning this stuff, you probably already believe in this stuff, but I just figured I'd share why I'm interested in it myself. But it's just fascinating to me, all the different aspects of it. It's just so much more fun and cool than the stuff I've ever worked on before. So the Graph was the team that brought me on as my first opportunity. I didn't know how to get my first blockchain job because I literally had I would say not found, but kind of started diving down the rabbit hole the week that I applied for my first Web3 job. So I knew nothing about Ethereum or Solidity. I didn't know any of this stuff, but it turns out the job market's pretty hot right now. So if you kind of have either a really great resume, or you have some good experience just in some parts of software development, you can often just get your foot in the door if you can find some way that accompanies that technology. So for me, GraphQL was something I've been working on for 4 years at AWS, and before that even. And the Graph used GraphQL, and also I felt like the Graph plays this important developer infrastructure piece that you need to build dApps. It's part of what I call the Web3 stack. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. But I also want to answer just any general questions around the career shift, because in April, Web3 wasn't I would say as there just wasn't as much adoption, I think, around that term at the time. It was definitely starting to kind of pick up. I started seeing a few people that I look up to leave really great jobs to go into blockchain. And I had seen, of course, people like Preeti and a lot of other leaders that have been doing it for a long time. But I didn't really understand why people were well, I guess I just didn't understand the technology at that time. So as soon as I understood the technology, it was extremely compelling. And I found out that it is, if you can just stand out a little bit, you can kind of get your foot in the door, and from there you can kind of figure out where you want to go from there. So I think this is a great place that you all are in to kind of leverage the existing skill set that you have, along with really great teachers, and kind of, I think, then get your first opportunity in this space. So with the Graph is, I guess, my first thing that I'll go over. And then after this is over, I'd love to take questions in general. I guess I'll share my screen. Yeah, my name is Nader Dabit. I work with Edge and Node, which is kind of like a partner company of the Graph network, which is a foundation/protocol. We are like the team that helps build and support the Graph protocol. But we also do a lot of other stuff like Web3 education, Web3 investing, and a handful of other things. So that's Edge and Node. And the Graph is the protocol that I work with the most right now. And it's an indexing protocol for querying and just building front-end applications or building applications on top of blockchain networks like Ethereum, IPFS, but we also support Near, Cosmos, or actually Near, and then we're about to support Cosmos and Solana. But we also support almost every EVM compatible chain as well. So Avalanche, Celo, Polygon, anything you can think of that's widely used. We support that. So why does the Graph exist? Well, if you're a developer coming from like the Web 2 space, you probably have access or experience using like really performant databases that we've worked with our entire careers, maybe an RDS database on Amazon, or maybe a SQL database, or maybe MongoDB or DynamoDB. These databases are optimized for both read and write operations. So when we talk about DynamoDB and the innovation that happens there at Amazon, you often hear things thrown around like, how many million read operations or write operations can you do per second or something like that? Well, unlike traditional databases, blockchains are just not optimized for the read operations. All of the innovation is kind of happening on the write operations. So you often hear things like Ethereum is like X number of transactions per second. The block time is this. You hear Solana. Kind of Solana is now becoming known as just a more performant blockchain with its own trade-offs. But you hear things like the transaction cost, the transaction time, or the block time, and things like that. But all this is focused on reads. What we don't really talk about a lot is actually, all this stuff is focused on writes. What we don't actually hear talked about is like how to read all of this data, because you can hit the network and you can ask for data at a certain point in time, but you can't do aggregate data. You can't do sorting, filtering, things like relational data, full text search, all this stuff that you typically need. So in the past, developers were kind of getting around this by building out their own proprietary indexing servers. So just like our old or our traditional databases that we work with, we have some type of API layer where we call it, the API talks to the database returns that request via the API, and then that comes back to the client. Well, this is kind of the way we're used to doing it, but the whole idea around blockchain data and decentralization and Web3 in general is data verifiability, and the fact that we are trusting we don't have to actually rely on trust, because the blockchain is a single source of truth, and therefore we can kind of trust that it has the right data. But when we have an intermediary endpoint or intermediary point of centralization, like we're taking this data, storing it in a database, and building our own API on top of it, then we're kind of missing now that important security layer that we kind of get from a blockchain. So instead of just reading the data directly from the chain, some developers were kind of building out these local servers where we index that data and then we serve it up. But again, this is kind of like not Web3. This is now getting back to kind of centralization. And again, like I will say that it depends, like there might be circumstances where this is still necessary, but for the most part, the idea is like we want to have decentralized APIs, decentralized everything, and we want to be able to still try to build out the types of applications that we're used to with that same user experience, but we still want decentralization. So kind of how do we get there? So when we think about what indexing data is and how we've used it already in our lives, one really great example is Google. So when we think of how do we access data on the internet, we don't actually need to go and find that data and find all the websites and read through all this information. Instead, Google provides this really nice API and this landing page where they actually have their own technology that scours the entire internet, and they actually store all this data in their own servers. And then what they offer us is an API for us to read and interact with that data. And then we can actually be given the information that we want and we can visit that site. So they're kind of like indexing the web. they serve it up in an API endpoint, and we read it. So this is like an example of indexing that we use every day. In addition, of course, to the database that we're kind of used to working with. Another good example is like a library. So we don't have to go to the library and walk through the entire library to find a book. We have these systems, like a really old school example might be the Dewey Decimal System, where we can just say, we want this book, and the app that we're using or the whatever in the old school way might have been actual cards. It will tell us exactly where that book is. So we know where that data is because all that information is indexed for us, and we can kind of go and read that. So how do we kind of accomplish that in the decentralized way? That's kind of what the graph does and why it exists. So it kind of sits in between the APIs that you would build with the graph are called subgraphs, by the way, but it kind of sits in between the smart contract and the user interface. And it allows you as a developer to kind of describe the information that you want to be made available and deploy it to this network. And the network will then index all of this data and serve it up from an HTTP endpoint, and in our case, GraphQL endpoint, that you can then read from your application. And the network also, which we'll go over in a second, kind of handles the data the verifiability of that data using the network and the incentive mechanisms around the graph token. So essentially, once you've deployed your API, the application that wants to use that API, and it's typically a public API because anyone can then use your API as well, not just yourself. Instead of relying kind of on a centralized service provider, it instead now has this query market that's comprised of a decentralized network of indexers, and all of these indexers are competing to provide the best service at the best price. So the network is kind of where that crypto, whatever, or the token comes into play. So the graph network is how this incentive mechanism works. And we have a few different participants that kind of power all of this. We have graph indexers, which run the actual nodes or the software that is on the network that indexes all of this data and allows developers to deploy APIs to them. We have subgraph developers, which is kind of what I would say that you might be more interested in and what I'm interested in. And this is kind of a subgraph developer is just an API developer. I might say, okay, there's this new NFT project, and I want to build a front end to kind of like interact with the data from that smart contract. I can just get the smart contract address, define the data model of the data that I want from that. It might be a token, like we're going to look at in just a moment, where you have like a token ID, you might have metadata and stuff like that. And then you deploy your subgraph, and as a developer, you can then start querying from it from a front end application. There's also, so we have indexers, subgraph developers, we have delegators and curators, and we'll go over those next, I guess. So the indexers, they're the ones that run the infrastructure. The subgraph developers are the API developers. And then we have curators and delegators. So curators can basically use their tokens to participate in the network. If they see an API that they think is going to be high quality or that will be useful, they can basically take their tokens and stake them or kind of curate, quote unquote, curate them into a subgraph, and therefore signal that this subgraph is highly valuable, and therefore indexers should index that data and make it available. And then we have delegators, which are essentially people that are non-technical that want to use their GRT to participate in indexing. So they kind of will take their GRT, their graph tokens, and use them with an existing indexer and share in the query fees. So right now we are powering over 1 billion queries per day. We're actually close to 2 billion. We might have actually hit 2 billion queries per day very recently. A lot of applications in the Web3 space, a lot of dApps use the graph. So if you've ever used Uniswap, they use the graph foundation, pull together live peer. There's quite a few here, even ENS. There's a lot of projects that kind of use the graph, and you can see all of their APIs are actually available at the graph.com dashboard. So let's talk about building a subgraph, and I'll try to run through this in a demo in just a moment. But essentially, we have this user interface that allows you to go and define the API that you want to build, or the quote unquote subgraph, as we call it again. And here you would just give it the subgraph a name and maybe a description, as well as some other metadata that you might want made available for other people to kind of like search by. You would then initialize a new graph project by using the Graph CLI, which is open source. You just run npm install -g like you would any other, command line tool, and then you can run the graph binary. Here we would say graph init. From there, we define the data model, which is where we are kind of describing the data that we want to be saved from this smart contract. So again, a good example, and the one we're going to use is an NFT, which is a token, and the token has properties. A token might have an ID, an owner, it might have metadata, and it might have like an image or something like that. So we can kind of like define that data model, and this is where it's kind of gets more technical. If you've ever used a schema in any form or fashion in your career, it's essentially that, but it's using GraphQL, and the GraphQL schema is just the data model. You also define the smart contract address and other configurations that we'll like go over in just a moment. And then you, and this is kind of what the schema might look like. And then you can deploy. So like here we have a schema that we might use for an NFT, where we have a token and then we have a user. The user is essentially just the address, but in the schema, we can actually define relationships as well between the data. So we might want to do a query like, I want to get a token and the user who owns that token, but I also might want to do a relational search where I say, I want to get all the users and their tokens. And doing this is, or having this functionality available is, pretty important when you're building modern applications. You typically need things like filtering, sorting, relational data, a full text search. You can pretty much do all that stuff within the graph tooling. Full text search is pretty easy to do as well. You just kind of have another few lines of code you would add that I'm not kind of adding here. So after you've defined your schema and you've defined what we haven't gone over quite yet is the mappings, which is kind of the business logic that you would write. You can then deploy your subgraph to the network by running graph deploy. And this would essentially package up your code and deploy it to that place, or it would kind of like deploy it, but it would also then be available in the user interface that we went over just a moment ago for you to then try out. So you would then be given a GraphQL playground that you can start using. You'll also be given the API endpoint that you can then just plug in. And then from here, you can just start running queries against it. So at this point, we're kind of like in a staging environment. If you would like to then publish this to the decentralized network, you can then do that as well. And that will essentially just kind of publish a main version of this and make it available for people to start curating on, or you to start curating on as well. And then you can just start querying from your API. And it looks pretty much just like any GraphQL API. You're given an API endpoint, you would define your query. You would then create a client using any traditional GraphQL client like Apollo or Urkel or whatever you would like to use. You could even use something like Fetch or Axios. And then you can then just run queries. So here we have just a really basic example of how you might do that. And we kind of are querying data and defining the query all here in about 15 or 20 lines of code. So I have a workshop if anyone's interested in kind of like learning how to build this. I was planning on going through that, but I think this will be taking quite a while. So I'm just going to share the link in the chat, and then I'm going to go to the graph dashboard and kind of look at a subgraph that I've already deployed myself before. So I'm going to try to make this a little smaller. Okay, so if I go to the graph.com, I can go to the Graph Explorer, and this kind of gives you an overview of some of the APIs that are out there. And there are actually two types of subgraphs, or two places you can deploy your subgraph. We have a decentralized network, which is kind of where we're ultimately trying to get with everything. And the decentralized network is kind of all the stuff that I talked about around, having the indexers and the curators and stuff. But there's also kind of like what I would consider almost like a staging environment, or even where you might say we do our development on for new features and stuff, and then ultimately they become available in the decentralized network. But the hosted service is kind of like the initial version of the graph when we launched without the decentralized network. And this is essentially a centralized service that was the first iteration of the graph. And this is also a place that you can deploy to for now as well. So once you've deployed your subgraphs, you'll have like a dashboard here that you can start looking at all the ones that are available. Of course, you can actually open up any of these and start using them as well. But I'm gonna get to my dashboard. Yesterday, I deployed a subgraph for Near, and Near is kind of like a chain that I'm not that familiar with. So that was my first time doing that. That was pretty cool. And then, of course, most of my other ones are going to be either Ethereum or EVM. So Foundation is a NFT marketplace. So let's maybe try testing one of these out. So I'm going to query for tokens. And here I can actually go and do schema introspection and get all of the information about this. So we have an ID, a token ID, content URI, token IPFS path, name, created at timestamp. So we can query for this. And this gives you all the information. And then we can also do, like I mentioned before, filtering, sorting, and things like that. So I can say order by, created at timestamp, and then order direction descending. And this will kind of give us the most recent tokens. And here we have the content URI. So we might be able to just copy and paste that. And the token IPFS path is here. So if we go to ipfs.io/IPFS, and then we can actually get the image here. And if we go to a foundation, you'll kind of see like these are the NFTs that are available. And a lot, if you kind of like view some of these, they will probably relate to what you see on the front page, but I'm not sure. Oh, these are trending. Okay. So what we're pulling down is ordered by creation date. So we're kind of like pulling down the most recent ones. So with that being said, that's kind of about it. I would say if you're looking to try out to build out a subgraph, I have this building a subgraph workshop is using the foundation smart contracts. And you can kind of try this out and build out a subgraph. It shouldn't take you more than 30 minutes to an hour. I would say at the most, if you just copy and paste everything I'm doing here. And then I have one other workshop that I just released yesterday for building a subgraph on Near protocol. And this is for also an NFT subgraph. I'm sorry, NFT API for something called Near Misfits. So both of these are kind of really great introductory examples to kind of how you might build APIs on different networks like Ethereum or EVM and Near. So with that being said, I think that's about it. From here, I would love to take some questions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
That was awesome. Thank you, Nader. There were some questions in chat. I think we handled most of them, but these are just common questions, like can a subgraph be modified? My understanding is you can modify it after you create it. You just can't change like the GitHub repo and the name of it, right?
Yeah, you can change everything except for maybe the name of it. And I'm not sure if that's even the case. Let me see if you can change the name maybe. Yeah, you can change the subtitle, the description, the GitHub URL, and the metadata, but I don't think you can change the name. And you can also, of course, change the code.
Okay, cool. Another question was, are we retrieving the data real time, or is the data stored in a local server of the graph? And so I think this comes down to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. The way it works is kind of like with smart contracts, every time, of course, a transaction is written to the chain, we have a record of that, and we can essentially define, and what we do in the subgraph and the configuration is we define the smart contract address, and then what the subgraph will do once it's deployed, it will then go to that address and it will look for every single event that's ever, or every single transaction that's ever happened. And in your subgraph, you have an area to define the events that you want to index from. So typically, if you have an ERC 721 contract, for example, for an NFT, every time a transfer happens, an event is emitted. And in that event, you have 3 arguments. One is the from address, one is the to address, and one is the token ID. And then using that information, you can then either call back to the graph node or back to the contract to get any additional information. And all of that information is then saved and indexed. That's kind of the whole idea, is like it's indexed into this server. And then from then on, any new transaction that also happens is also indexed. So the graph node keeps up with all of the new updates in the future, as well as everything in the past, and it kind of just self-updates.
Very helpful. I'll take questions. I'll go, let people who have their hand raised go, and then there's questions in the chat. So we'll come to that once we finish the people who raise their hands. So Saurabh, do you want to go?
Yeah. Hey, hi Nader. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the amazing session. So I have built a very small application where we can send messages to Ethereum addresses. So there I am leveraging the graph to retrieve the message. Also, what I'm doing is I'm encrypting that message and putting it on IPFS. I followed your tutorial regarding that. So my question is, can I directly talk to IPFS, because you mentioned it at the starting, or yeah?
Yes, check out that near workshop that I shared here. Let me put a link to it. In that workshop, I'm actually talking to IPFS. So essentially what you would be doing is you would, in the subgraph, you have a mapping, which is where the actual logic happens. So like every time an event is fired, it triggers a function in this mapping. And the mapping will be anywhere between just 3 lines of code to maybe 40 or 50 lines of code, depending on how much functionality you have. But in that mapping, you will have everything you need to be able to talk to a few different places. You can talk to IPFS, so you can say, I have this this hash or something that came in, and I want to get the metadata. So I'm going to call IPFS. IPFS returns a JSON object. You parse that JSON object. In that object, you might have, in the case of an NFT, something like an image. You might have traits. So like in OpenSea, you kind of can have these different traits and stuff like that. So you have all this information. And then what you would do is you kind of create an object, or a map, or whatever, however you might think of that as coming from whatever language that you're used to working with, that will represent that type in your schema. So if you have a token type, you might have an ID, a name, and a description. Your object will have an ID, a name, and a description. Then you just call token.save, and that will save it into the node. And then essentially that function just gets run over and over and over after you've deployed it, and it automatically kind of does that for you.
All right, great.
I think the easiest way to understand this would be for me to have either kind of walk through all this in the workshop, which I thought that might take a little too much time, or to actually go through one of these workshops and kind of build one from scratch. It's very, very eye-opening to kind of see how this actually works, and it kind of clears up a lot of maybe the tougher conceptions around just conceptualizing this without actually having seen it done.
Yeah. So what I love about Graph is they make it very easy, and once you have the contract address, all of my queries were auto-generated. Like the schema was auto-generated for me from the contract, so that made it very easy. So,
yeah. The CLI is getting better and better, And right now it already does a lot for you. So like the CLI will ask you for a few prompts, like when you're generating this boilerplate, it'll ask you for, of course, the address, it'll ask you for the network, and it'll give you an option of all the available networks. But you can also do things like pass in an index events flag, which is what's used in my workshop. And this will essentially fetch the ABI from Etherscan. So we'll download the ABI,
Yep.
it will parse the ABI, it'll look for any events that are there, and then it'll automatically generate the event handlers for you, both in the configuration as well as the mappings. So it kind of generates a lot of this code for you.
Yeah.
And then
So
you can
actually,
go
I
in
did
and
not
just
have
modify it.
I did not have the ABI. So it asked me for a file and I was able to just quickly link the JSON file. So yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's also an option if it doesn't pull it down for you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks.
Sure.
Awesome. Anyone else wants to raise their hand? Otherwise I'll take, okay, there's Benjamin. Benjamin, go ahead.
Thanks, Preeti. Nader, thanks so much. This was really, really fascinating, and it seems like a really powerful tool. Those of us who are interested in developing DAOs, we also follow your work, of course, with Developer DAO and such a great project. Would love to hear kind of an update on that, and also when you're reopening for new members.
Hey, yes, sorry, I'm just standing up because I've been sitting down already for a couple of hours this morning. Yeah, so we actually just submitted a proposal or overview for the community to kind of come to an agreement on around opening memberships back up. So it should be opening back up. It actually was sent in last night, so it should be opening back up in the next couple of days, actually. And it's going to be opening up in a couple of phases. First of all, I guess I'll give an overview of like how Developer DAO is doing and what it is. It's basically a community that it's community owned, that is focused just on software development and really not focused at all on a lot of the stuff that you hear often in around crypto, around speculation and investing and stuff. Like everything that we talk about, we don't like ban people from talking about that stuff, but everyone there is a builder, and we're focused on building stuff and creating stuff and teaching and education, and it's kind of like that type of vibe there. But it's a community that is, you know, formed into the structure of a DAO, and to be a participant early on, we essentially had this like NFT launch that was actually completely free, because a lot of the DAOs that are out there, you have to pay money to get into, which is fine, you know, for whatever other DAOs that are doing whatever they're doing. But I thought, like, to make this community as accessible as possible and try to make it as fair as possible, we wanted to make it free. So anyone that wanted to join could essentially just mint this NFT. Now, when I say free, it actually is only free to the extent of not having to pay the gas fee, because to mint the NFT, you still had to pay gas. And at the time, it was anywhere between $20 to $60 to get in. So we ended up just setting aside a bunch of money actually and just minting and handing them out to community members for free as well, to kind of try to get more people. So what we ended up with is like a community of 5,500 or so people. A lot of them, or most of them, I would say, are new to Web3 and are just kind of in there learning together and building stuff. We have an event that's planned, a big conference that's planned called Web3Con that's happening in a couple of months. We have a lot of the people that are building out some of the most important protocols in Web3 that are part of the community, and they're sharing, and we share a lot of educational material. I would say one of the most valuable things that's probably come out of it is our curation of educational content that we share on Twitter. So you don't even have to really be a member of the DAO. You can just follow us on Twitter and see a lot of the stuff that we're posting. But we ran out of tokens because we didn't really anticipate, or I didn't really anticipate exactly how this thing would work. And therefore we didn't have any more ways for people to get in. So we kind of have been figuring out new ways to get in. So the two ways that we're opening membership back up is that we are just going to open back up for new members using that ERC 721 token, the NFT. So that means you can pick one up off of OpenSea secondhand market, which will probably be more than it was when it was free, obviously, because other people that have maybe bought more are kind of now trying to sell those. And I think the price right now is like 0.05 ETH, which is a couple $100, which is, again, more than I would like. But we've also set aside a couple of hundred of those that we're just going to give away for free that we still haven't done yet, that are going to be for completely free scholarships. So we'll have a forum set up for anyone that wants to join. Hopefully we can kind of, share those and get a lot of people in for free that way. And then we're also launching a governance token, and we're setting aside a large portion of that for people that we also want to get in for free. So if you can acquire the governance token from a friend that is in the DAO, which everyone that's a member will be allocated some of these, you can use that to enter the DAO, or you can apply for a scholarship. So that's kind of how we're doing it. We have a lot of plans for essentially scholarship type of deals. You can also pick them up off the secondhand market or from a friend.
So cool. Thank you so much. I really love that you're consciously focusing on value creation rather than speculation. So easy to lose your head and just try to make your DAO the next meme coin. So thank you for doing that, and really looking forward to following it.
Awesome. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, there was a question that Luis had. He said in the chat, what are some guidelines for deciding if it's more appropriate to use the graph versus running your own node and querying against that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say start with the bare minimum when you're building anything and just go from there and only add things when you absolutely need them. So I would say if you can kind of make your app work without the graph, then no need for additional complexity. But like at some point, well, maybe not at some point, depending, like you might just be building out a pretty basic app and you never need it. But like if you get to that point where you're trying to make something work and it's just not working, like you need some type of data set that just isn't able to be queried using your Infura or Alchemy API, then you would probably use the graph. Okay. So I would say, it's kind of like when I think about building applications with React or something, I don't add a dependency if I can build it myself. I don't want to just use some package just for the heck of it. But if I get to the point where I just can't get it to work, then I'll then go and add that complexity.
Yep, makes sense. Ram, do you want to go?
Yes, thank you. Hey, I come from the security background. So given you're connecting to different chains, is there a specific standard available when you're connecting to each one of them, or does each one have its own authentication mechanism when you're connecting to each and every chain to read data? Or is this all open information?
So there's a couple things to that. I think that we ultimately believe in like a multi-blockchain, a multi-chain, whatever future, in the sense that we don't think like Ethereum is gonna like win or Solana is gonna win. We just think that we're gonna have a lot of different options and different people are gonna use different chains for different things. So therefore we're kind of supporting as much as we can. But the first thing we supported was EVM, Ethereum, actually, it was the first one. And then we made more EVM compatible chains. And it really only takes us like a week to add another EVM compatible chain because everything is almost the exact same. Mainly the difference is essentially kind of when you really think about it, it's the RPC endpoint because the API is the exact same. So for us to add additional EVM compatible chains, it's fairly simple compared to adding a non-EVM chain, which is like orders of magnitude harder. We essentially have to kind of write a completely brand new indexer software from scratch. So we've added Near, Cosmos, and Solana are all either supported or on the Near roadmap to be supported. And each of those is like a multi-months long engineering feat just to get it to kind of like beta. So that's kind of an overview of the networks that we support. But as far as from a security perspective, the only authentication or authorization that happens when you're dealing with the graph is when you're deploying your API from your command line. So you're given I forgot what we call it, like an authentication key or let's see here. You're given an access token, and then that access token you store locally. We give you a command actually that kind of essentially sets it as kind of like an environment variable or something. And then when you deploy your API, it just prevents anyone from deploying their API to someone else's dashboard. But everything that happens from then is all public data. So it's all read operations, and we don't support any write operations. So it's all public data. So there's no need, we don't have to worry about security as far as, authorization and fine-grained access controls and things like that. One thing that we are considering and that we're working on improving is kind of like client-side tooling for write operations. I think that when you think about a developer that comes from the traditional world, we use the fetch or the access API to send both post and get operations. And even GraphQL, you can use the same GraphQL API for querying and also for mutations. When you come into the Web3 world, and you start using the graph, then you're now using two APIs. You're using like Ethers or Web3 to write operations, and then you're using like the graph or some GraphQL API to read. So we're working on kind of an additional feature set to the graph tooling that allows developers to have both querying and mutations. So there's this big, very, I would say, successful team called the Guild in the GraphQL world. They've created some of the most used GraphQL tooling in the entire world, the entire open source world. They also were originally, like, some of the people there were the creators of Meteor and also Apollo. We've basically given them like a $48 million grant to join the Graph to help us build that. So we now have one of the best GraphQL teams in the world that joined the Graph to help us build out some of this tooling for client-side development to make mutations or, quote unquote, like write operations compatible with a single API. So instead of having to use Ethers and a GraphQL API, you can just use a single API to kind of write and read operations and hopefully make the developer experience easier and better in the future. But this is still kind of early on days, so we're probably not going to have a prototype for that for another few months.
Thank you.
Awesome. Stefan?
Hey, Nader, thanks for your time. I have a little bit of a non-technical question for you. So in the beginning, you pointed out that that you're working now in the Web3 space after working in the Web2 space for now almost a year. And I would be really interested because you were, I can really relate to your reasoning about switching into this different world because the technical challenges are so much more interesting and you have to figure out so many foundational things in this space because, well, they haven't been figured out yet. So my question would be, now that you were working in this space for almost a year, did you think from the beginning that it will kind of make the world a better place or somehow it has a good impact on the world? Or what is your reasoning on or thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, yes. I ultimately felt that moving into this space was a much better impact, in my opinion, for the world. Like, just I felt better about myself working towards what I think ultimately is going to be a positive impact, especially versus Amazon, where I was working before, which honestly, like over the first year or so, I was like really, hyped about it. But like over time, it started wearing more on me, understanding like the impact of a lot of these large corporations and stuff. And like, I was almost ashamed to be working there by the time I left there, to be quite honest. And one of the things that really struck me really early on about Web3 and crypto, around the time that I was kind of investigating this stuff, I had a family member / friend visit from Lebanon. He moved to Atlanta just a couple of months before that because of the financial, I would say, not just the political and financial crisis that was happening there at the time. Essentially, he lost his business, his home, and all of his life savings because of the inflation, and the government had basically locked everyone's bank account there. And he literally moved to Atlanta, left his entire family there to kind of work at a mattress store because like he lost what he had was like over $1 million, or so business and savings and stuff. And at the same time, I was doing some research and seeing that, crypto in general was being used in places like Venezuela and Lebanon and Syria and Libya to kind of get around these situations. And if we could only make that more accessible and better, then people would not be impacted so negatively from those things. So that was one of the first reasons why I felt like this technology would be an overall benefit for the world. Looking up more into that, you might find that 1.7 billion people are unbanked because of things like prejudice and even places that don't allow women to open bank accounts and things like that. I think, though, that when you really start looking beyond that, there are actually a lot of trade-offs that the blockchain and decentralization is going to end up making. Just like the internet has negative and positives, if you try to outline all the negatives about the internet existing, and you looked at that 20 years from now without showing the positives, you would probably be very skeptical. people being able to blackmail and like harass people online and all this other stuff. But in reality, we kind of realize that there's trade-offs. And that's kind of more the way I look at it now. I think that there's a lot of benefits, but we also need to acknowledge all of the trade-offs and find solutions and ways to kind of address those, just to make the world a better place, if that truly is what we want to do.
Thanks a lot for your answer.
Yeah, thank you. On a similar question in the chat, they're asking like, Igor was asking, how did you personally decide on what's signal versus noise in the space?
Yeah, it's a lot more complicated. I think even in the Web 2 space, you have a lot of people that are like me, that are developer advocates or that are investors in companies, and they want to kind of pump up, quote unquote, even then the technology that they're working on. But in Web 3, it's even more so because there's even more financial incentives because more people actually do have ownership. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's good in the fact that this wealth is kind of like maybe spread slightly more equitably to the participants of the networks and the protocols. But it also means that people might be like pumping their bags, quote unquote, or they might be shilling something that they don't truly believe in. I think the best way to kind of get around that is to focus, at least to me, people that are building and not talking about that stuff, and go to where the developers are. If you see developers building, and the real developers are going to be out there creating and doing stuff and working on the stuff that they find interesting, and they're not going to be talking about, you know, the next, I don't know, dog coin or something like that. So I think finding those groups of people and hanging out with them and building relationships with them is probably not a bad strategy. Also, if you're a developer and you kind of look around the ecosystem and you see the tools and the protocols that make sense to you, then that says a lot more than kind of like a landing page trying to sell you something. Find the tooling protocols that you want to work with that makes sense to you maybe. But yeah, it's not easy. I don't think I've even figured out a concise, clear answer for that. It just kind of depends.
Awesome. And then one small question Rohan had was, does the graph provide support for subscriptions?
So that's a great question. We have subscription support built in, but it's not production ready. It's not something that we would say that you should use in production, even though we have a lot of projects and teams using it. We want to build it natively into the protocol, and it's something we're working on right now. To get around that, you can just use your typical Ethereum events and subscribe to those using Ethers.js or Web3.js.
Cool. Ryan?
Hi, yeah, can you briefly describe some of the differences in like development workflow from Web 2 to Web 3? Because like with Web 2, I feel like I'm always iterating, but with Web 3, I feel like once the contract's, you know, kind of there, it's kind of like, it's done. So I'm trying to wrap my head around how you know, that transition. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if you're a front-end developer, it's going to be about the same because you're going to be iterating and creating new UI and new features and stuff. But as like a back-end developer, it's going to be a lot different. First of all, you're not going to be able to transfer a lot of your actual real-world knowledge over from a SQL database, you know, advanced knowledge to kind of like smart contract development. But your programming and logic experience will actually obviously transfer very well, and like you can probably pick up smart contract development fairly quickly if you've just written TypeScript or anything like that before. But like your question in particular, yeah, if you're a front-end developer, you're going to still be iterating a lot. But if you're a smart contract developer, it's a lot harder to kind of figure out the best workflow. So often you'll see instead of a deployment happening, you know, every day or every week, you might just have an update that happens every few months. And then you have to then decide, do you want to upgrade the contract to a new version or do you want to do a proxy contract? Upgrading has its own trade-offs because you now are kind of going to be deprecating that previous contract and asking everyone to move over. If you're doing stuff in DeFi, you have to think about things like liquidity and stuff like that. But you can also instead opt to go for a proxy, but this adds a lot of complexity. So one of the things that you have to, or I would say one of the things that you'll notice in this space is that we have bounties that are really, really a lot higher than the average in the Web 2 world. So we have put out a $2.5 million bounty ourselves, and you've seen bounties in the millions of dollars for these smart contracts. Because if you're going to be building a protocol that has
tens, hundreds, millions, or maybe even billions of dollars locked in, then it makes sense to pay someone $2 or $3 million to kind of find that bug before the hacker does. So all these things taken into consideration, I would just say it depends on the type of application you're building and whether or not you have liquidity that's going to be locked in the contract.
That's really helpful. Krishna, I'll just kind of speak your question. He says, if you deploy a subgraph onto the decentralized network, how does the read latency compare between a hosted service versus like a published subgraph?
So we've gotten to the point where it's gotten very, very close. I think when we first deployed, it was a little slower on the decentralized network, but now it's kind of getting more in step with the hosted service. You're looking at something in the range of like 1 to 200 milliseconds or something like that, which is probably not as fast as something like a Lambda function running at the edge on AWS, but it is pretty quick.
Okay, that's helpful. Sagar?
Hey Nader, thanks for stopping by today.
Hey.
I wanted to know what people generally don't ask you about, but you're most excited about sharing.
Yeah, that's a good question. To me, it's kind of the thing that I'm really, really most interested in is just education and how we can kind of make education accessible to or opportunities really accessible to everyone in the world, and therefore I think education just plays a key part in that. And I think there's all different types of ways in Web3 to kind of find education, but also you can be an educator. Like everything that you're learning here, you can then take and speak at meetups and give conference talks. And one of the things that I like about Web3 in general is the grants programs. And I think education and grants have a very, very, they have a lot of like overlap when you start looking at the ultimate objectives of these grants programs. A lot of times the objective is to onboard new developers into their ecosystem. So when you're done with this class here and you want to get your foot in the door in one of the protocols that you really respect a lot, maybe you want to work with Solana, you could possibly go to their grants program and say, think of a really cool tutorial that you want to write, and then you just submit that as a grant, and then you might actually get paid a couple $1,000s to write this tutorial. But most importantly, you'll actually meet the people that are involved in that grant process, build a relationship with them. And if you deliver something like high quality, then you might open the door for an actual role at that company or something like that, or at that protocol. So I think education and finding ways to kind of leverage that for your career is something that a lot of people don't know about. I think like a lot of people think I need to have like a really great resume to get hired, but in reality, your GitHub and being able to maybe create a really solid explanation of something and putting that as your way to get hired, maybe even more valuable, you know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Writing is huge for breaking into anything that you are a novice in. Because I think writing forces you to just like learn faster as well and really form a concrete understanding of what you're trying to write about. Krishna?
Yeah, thanks Nader for doing this Q&A. I have a question. I want to hear just your thoughts around the argument saying that, let's say there are a bunch of DApps that you're using Graph to read the data from the chain, then doesn't the DApps are dependent on the graph at that point? And since there is no validation between is this the same information on the chain, or is this some indexer or someone messing up or providing there? And especially that argument becomes even more bigger when you are doing reads and writes both going through the graph network, right? At some point, graph network can say, you know what, why should we even write to Ethereum or EVM? Why can't we just write it to our own, some other layer automatically for the DApp, and the app can just say hey, write it wherever the gas fees is low, or however you want to do it. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the main things to know about the network and how it operates is that there are incentives for people to actually find indexers that are serving the wrong data and do what we call slashing, meaning if you want to run an indexer, you can't just put an indexer up and start making money. You actually have to put up some type of stake or tokens. And using those tokens, you're kind of putting them up and you're saying, okay, these are my stake to run this indexer. And I'm also liable for if I serve up any wrong data. So what we have as part of the incentive mechanisms is this fisherman role that anyone can play. And if you find a indexer that's serving the wrong data, you can do this, yourself or programmatically. I think most of the people doing it these days are doing it programmatically. If they find an indexer that's serving the wrong data, that indexer gets slashed and the fisherman gets that reward. So it's kind of like this game theory mechanism that's built into the network to incentivize people to serve the correct data, but also incentivize people to find indexers that are malicious and actually expose them. So that's one thing to keep into consideration. The other thing is you were asking about what happens if the graph goes down. Well, that's the idea around a decentralized network. Like we know that Ethereum isn't going to go down because we aren't relying on a single server. AWS might be hosting 25, 50. Let's say one day they're hosting 99% of the network, which they will never do, but let's say that did happen. Even if AWS went down, 1% of the network is still up, meaning I can still interact with the network. I think that's the idea with Graph. We don't have the ultimate goal, like we do have a hosted service and we also have a decentralized network. If you're using the decentralized network, you're essentially able to query from a host of indexers that are out there. If one of those indexers goes down, the network is still up. And there is this idea of progressive decentralization, meaning like when we launched the Graph protocol, it was a centralized service. We then launched the smart contracts and the availability to run a decentralized version of this. In July, we then launched the dashboard that allows people to actually make this more accessible to everybody. And like we're continuing to make that better. But essentially it is a decentralized network and you're not going to have to worry about it going down if you're using that network.
And can you talk about the incentives that you provide to make sure there is no consolidation in the indexers? Like, you won't end up with a bunch of big whale indexers and and they might affect the network in one way or the other.
So I think that one of the things that we have built in that tries to address that is this idea of like a bonding curve, meaning that if a new person deploys a subgraph to an indexer, they actually are, well, not deploys, but if someone, well, I guess a developer can also curate, but let's say someone deploys a subgraph and then someone wants to curate on that, then they are essentially putting stake, and the value of their stake will increase if more people get behind that subgraph. But so essentially providing an incentive for people to only signal on subgraphs that are valuable, but also to continue to add more signal to high quality subgraphs and offer an incentive for those people. But I guess, is your question mainly though around the indexers themselves? Like what if someone controls more indexers than someone else or something like that?
Exactly. Like, the indexer basically becomes like 3 or 4 big whale indexers and they do most of the indexing for like 90% of the subgraphs or more, something like that.
Well, I don't think that they have the control to kind of take over more indexing traffic. I think the ultimate goal is to have as many indexers as possible. So like, just like when you hear things discussed around Bitcoin, Solana, Ethereum, like which one is more centralized? And it depends on who you talk to. People will try to tell you that Ethereum is centralized, which I don't believe. And then some people will try to argue that Solana is centralized. I think the ultimate goal for all of these is to have as many nodes running as possible. And Solana would be a validator, and the Graph, it's an indexer. I think the ultimate goal is to have as many indexers as possible, because it doesn't matter if one indexer has 1 billion GRT staked and this other one only has like 100,000. They're both going to be serving traffic, and they're both going to be given equal opportunity to kind of serve that traffic, if that makes any sense. So the ultimate goal, I guess, to address that is more indexers, and over time we want to just increase the number of indexers. I don't know the number of indexers right now, but it's probably something like in the hundreds.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. And Luis asked, does the graph have plans to expand to L2 rollups?
Yeah, we already support some L2s. Let me actually go through and see which ones that we support right now.
I think you guys.
I know we support Arbitrum and Optimism. I'm not sure about the rollup, so let me check real quick.
Yeah, it says Arbitrum and Optimism. I don't see other ones. And then Polygon, which is another L2.
Yeah, we have a list of them somewhere. They're
It's
in
in
the
your
docs.
FAQ. At least it says
in the
the
FAQ.
hosted service. In the hosted service, the following networks are supported. And it has like Ethereum, all the Ethereum test nets, XDAI, Near, Matic.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the ZK rollups. I will definitely check into that. I mean, obviously it's probably something on our radar, but I'm not positive of our current support or our future support.
Yeah. Awesome. I know we're over time, so I want to be respectful of that. So thank you so much. This was actually very, very educational for me as well. Thanks for joining. And I guess if people have any additional questions about the graph or just in general, like where should they go?
I would, yeah, check out the graph.com, and from there you'll see a lot of documentation and places to play around with. And then from there, I would just go to my GitHub and check out a couple of my workshops, the two that I'll link if you want to kind of build out something yourself. And then just try to build something. I think just building a subgraph and deploying it and getting the feel of how all this stuff works will just give you a lot of understanding of how you might leverage this in your development career in the future.
Awesome. Thank you. This is awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're hiring, by the way. So I know someone
Yeah,
asked.
and I'll get in touch with you about that, and like so that we can kind of send people who are interested over to you guys.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank
All right.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.